last point of introduction is there was a writer by the name of Mauro Biglino. He was the Vatican's Masoretic expert. And just 2 points that he makes that I will share with you. He writes that the messages that Moses got on Sinai from God are primarily about building a civilization, a temple, an altar, and about a civic and urban center. He himself is uncertain as to whether the Hebrew people were ever meant to have a theology, a statement of doctrines. They were meant to be a living example, a light unto all nations. In that sense, I use the expression, they were God's beta site, God's people.
What's the name of your book again?
The name is rather long. It's something like Everything You Should Know About Christianity or something like that. But he wrote 4 or 5 books until the Vatican shut him down. In fact, I think he only wrote 2 or 3. And they
What's
wouldn't
his
publish
name?
him anymore. His name is Mauro, M-A-U-R-O, Biglino, B-I-G-L-I-N-O. And in fact, trying to buy his book, it was available on Kindle and then it disappeared. So I got it from a friend, but it was no longer available, being made available in English.
Thank you.
So his works were bound and held by the Vatican, but he has a very credible history of translating for the Vatican. But, there's many things that troubled him. And I won't go into it now, it's another discussion, but he was very troubled by the gap that's opened up under Christianity between the ancient Israel text and what Christians are told today and believe today. And I get too sidetracked if I get into it, but it's very, very interesting how he raises issue. And he was very troubled by, for example, the Sabbath issue and what Rome has done with the Sabbath issue. So I don't want to get too sidetracked into that, but there's a name to note. So last week we talked about this rogue, evil governor called Antiochus, and he, as you may recall, he was the guy who forced the Hebrew people to engage in sacrilegious practices. Now, most of the Hellenizers didn't do this, but Antiochus was the guy who did it. And he had officers or police to enforce and go around the towns and the cities and just and make sure the Jews were not following their customs and their practices. And this caused the Jews to actually fall into 3 or 4 large categories under this oppression that I think are useful for discussion purposes. Because we can relate to them. Now, firstly, there were, unfortunately, collaborators, those that actually aided the Hellenizers. And many of them were, and we will talk about this soon, were the Sadducees. Then there was the accommodators, those who accommodated the Syrian persecution out of fear. Some of them maybe out of confusion because the way laws were being interpreted by some Jews was different. And so you might think of the Second World War and SDAs under Hitler. Many of them chose to accommodate what he was asking them to do out of fear, and maybe some out of confusion. The next group really was a pacifist group. Now, this was a group of people that would die for their faith, but wouldn't fight for their faith. They waited on God to intervene. So now you can come back again to the Holocaust situation. Jews had the opportunity, and many did in the late 1930s. They knew there's a bad moon on the rise and bad things were coming, but many stayed. We know how that story ended. But we also saw that pacifism in concentration camp behavior. When people are disempowered, they become amazingly passive. But then we have the aggressors, and these are the rebellious, call to arms people. And that was the Maccabees, the house of Hasmon. So many Jews at this time were not well versed in their faith, and there were divisions emerging between ethical Jews and religious Jews. Still on display today, still seen today. So now let's talk about this fight for freedom. The Maccabean era, as I said, runs from 165 to 63 BC. And there's a family known as the Hasmoneans. Sometimes the H is dropped and they're called the Hasmoneans, or the Maccabees. And they regained control of the temple and they ruled the state of Jerusalem for 100 years. And so you think that they would get a lot done. But as we'll see, there's a lot of infighting, family fighting, and lost opportunities in this period. But as David mentioned, this follows Maccabees 1 and 2 from the Apocrypha. And Judaism history tells us that God has actually used and chosen dynastic Hebrew families in the past, and we can recall those. And here we go into another period where the leaders of the Jews would be a family line for 100 years. So in a small town, and I believe it was just north of Jerusalem, there lived an elderly priest, and some say he was around 145 years old, and we would say that was elderly. And his name was Mattathias Hasmonei, meaning house of Hasmon, or Hasmon. And he observed one day a Syrian official in the town square forcing a man to make a heathen sacrifice and to eat pig meat. And he became enraged in the name of God, and he first killed the Jew that had performed the sacrilege, and then he killed the Syrian official that was enforcing it. Okay, so that got to be a hot place to be. So he and his 5 sons escaped to the hills, the Judean hills, where they met up with the Hasidim, or the Hasidics, the ultra-white group that were already there. Remember, the Hasidim were called the pious ones, or the passionate Orthodox. They were the zealots, right-wing, rebellious, and already in the mountains. Now, Mattathias wore grieving garments to reflect the loss of his country and the loss of his people. And that inspired people, inspired the whole nation. They began to see themselves differently. They began to feel nationalistic. However, the Syrians came on one Sabbath day and killed many of them. But many of them, we're told, wouldn't fight because it was a Sabbath. To the Greeks felt that Sabbath keeping was an indication of laziness. To the Jews were aware in their ancient text from Moses that the Sabbath was sacred. In fact, Biglino points out in his book was the Sabbath is the only commandment, and there weren't commandments. There's no Decalogue, there's no commandments, as he says. They were the words of God. But there's only one commandment, as we would say, that's mentioned twice in the Hebrew Bible. And it's mentioned last. And it's the only commandment that was mentioned with a condition of death if it was broken. So if you were a Torah Jew, the Sabbath was critically important to the point of they would not fight or defend themselves on the Sabbath. And the Syrians, I believe, knew that. But Mattathias soon died, and his sons carried on the revolt, guerrilla warfare style. And they would fight every day of the week except Sabbath. And they had such success that by 165 BC, the eldest son, whose name was Judas, which is the Greek form of the name for Judah, and that's why he's called Judah Maccabeus, was able to recapture the temple, cleanse the temple, take out the heathen altar, put an altar back in of natural stone, and restore biblical worship. This was a military victory. And to commemorate that military victory, each year on the 14th of December is the Feast of Dedication. As you know, it's called Hanukkah. Festival of Lights, sometimes it's referred to as. And they celebrate the miracle of the oil. They only had enough oil to burn for one day, but 8 days later, that candle was still burning. The feast was celebrated, and this event was celebrated by Jesus. mentioned in the Bible. And as really they become the source of courage for Israel's fight for independence in 1947 and subsequently the Zionist movement. So although Zionism is a secular movement, embedded in the psyche of many, many Israelites and Jews is the desire to manifest what they believe was God's original promise and original intent for them. So some of the features of this Hasmonean era was the Maccabees initially were focused on freedom, but then they turned their focus on the personal and political agendas, secularism, and Hellenistic values. And so this produced a time of unrest. And within 20 years, many battles were fought with the Syrians. They killed Judas, they killed the next brother. And this was also a period that actually Antiochus died. He went to fight the Parthians, and on his way back, evidently died suddenly. Now, another son of the five, probably the third son, middle son, his name was Jonathan, and he became the leader, but eventually he was hooked into a pseudo peace deal with the Syrians. They entrapped him and executed him. And unfortunately, some Hellenists were complicit in this and were emissaries for Syrian military. However, in 142 BC, the youngest brother, Simon, obviously more of a diplomat than his fighting brothers, made a deal with Syria, and the Jewish people were granted independence under the reign of the family name, the Hasmoneans. But significantly here is that Simon had requested support from the Romans, and Rome had Syria surrounded at that time, had them under a lot of pressure, and Syria was about to fall. But the most notable thing here was that the Hasmoneans signed a treaty with Rome against Syria. The doorway for Rome was now open. Very few of the Hasmonean family believed that Rome would walk through when they did. So the Syrians were gone from Jerusalem, and the descendants of Simon became the leaders of the priestly side. But unfortunately, infighting would prove lethal to this family. Simon's son, his name was John Hyrcanus, and he reigned for 30 years, quite a long time, 134 down to 104 BC. And he was a Sadducee, or became a Sadducee. And Maccabees actually and Josephus write very little about John. Not as much is known of his reign, other than he sided with the wealthy, he supported Hellenism, and he tended to be a cruel man. So just a quick look back on now on the diversity of Judaism in this time. Overall, Judaists write and report that it was a good time for them. At worst, an okay time for them. But their critics say, look, they were there twice as long as the previous rulers, and they really didn't get much done at all. And if you read an expression here I like from Tomasino in his book in describing Jewish or Judaism in this time, he says it's a cord of woven threads. Remember I said last week it was streams, and you look for currents within those streams. This was not a unified people at all, or a unified nation at all. But they were a cord of woven threads bound by a belief in God, one God, and a reverence for Jerusalem. And I might tuck in there the books of Moses, the Pentateuch, the Torah. And so this was also a time of emerging sectarianism that we'll see in the time of Jesus. And under John Hyrcanus, two names that are very familiar to us are now penned. And that is the two central parties being the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And I want you to note that these two groups are not mutually exclusive. They are the two main sects that were coexisting as varieties, two varieties of Judaism. The first group, the largest group, was the Pharisees. These were the Orthodox Jews. They were known as separatists. They were rigid, strict, and frequently quoted in literature as Hebrew nationalists. The key here to the Pharisees is they only recognized a king that was a descendant of King David, and only accepted a high priest that was a descendant of Aaron. These were two breakpoints for them. They upheld the oral traditions, the Jewish oral traditions, and the laws of Moses, and they adamantly defended monotheism. But overall, on reflection, broader reflection, they were a group that were sincerely trying to please God, the way that they understood God wanted to be pleased. The masses followed them. They had the support of the people, strongly connected to the people. But the New Testament portrays them negatively because they were trapped in legalism. And many Christians, as we know, went the same route. They prized compliance with the law, and we recognize that call to compliance with the law. They exhibited a simple lifestyle. They were unpretentious. They were known for their civility, and they respected their elders. Christ railed against their legalism and their lack of compassion, their hypocrisy, pious on the outside, wicked on the inside. Now, those who opposed the Pharisees and supported the Hasmonean family were called Sadducees, meaning the righteous ones. Sometimes that Sadducees is interpreted to mean a word called Zadok, which evidently was a family of high priests back in the time of David. But the Sadducees controlled the temple and the election of priests. And sometimes the Pharisees supported their elections, but sometimes not. They were only a small group, of the core group being the priestly leaders. They became known as the Hebrew rationalists. They controlled temple operations. They admired the Greeks. They forged alliances with the Greeks. They were the wealthy class, and their alliances were really to retain their wealth and their power. The Sadducees were actually often outpowered by the Pharisees just by numbers. And so the Sadducees learned to be very shrewd, to work their way around the religious dogma of the Pharisees and the might of numbers of Pharisees and the strength of the Pharisees as the teachers, the Pharisees morphing into rabbis. The Sadducees rejected all but the Mosaic books, Pentateuch. They did not believe in a Messiah. They didn't believe, therefore, in a resurrection. All blessings were only material, and all blessings were for this life. They had no acceptance or acknowledgement of an afterlife. They rejected the oral traditions, were probably overall described as religious conservatives themselves, but they would only accept that could be demonstrated. So we'd call them the science had to work. The science had to be good. If it couldn't be demonstrated, then they would not accept it. That's why blessings were always material. There was no such thing as spiritual blessing. Material in the sense of a child, land, money, material. And actually Big Lino supports that as well. They believed in free will, and importantly, they rejected the Greek notions of fate and determinism. But however, the Sadducees were reluctant to believe that God was not directing human affairs in some way. Confusion reigning. One of the keys here is that the Sadducees were not Judeans. They're not Juden. They were technically not Jews. They came from the northern and more prosperous parts of Palestine, what was used to be called the state of Israel. They came from the 10 northern tribes. And you might remember the deal that God made via Moses and the children of Israel regarding the promised land is they had to get their feet on the ground. God was not serving up their country, this new country, this promised land, on a plate. It was a contract. It was not a sweet deal in that sense. They had to fight their way in, earn it, and get their feet on the ground, and then God would protect them. But only 2 of the 12 brothers did that, and that was Judah and Simeon. And the others in the northern areas, they began to marry Canaanites, worship Canaanite gods, and very quickly became much more multi-ethnic. Okay, so right from the get-go, they were multi-ethnic, their region. And then when you think back on what the Assyrians did, I think it was the 7th or 8th century, when those Assyrian leaders came down, they exiled the Israelites and backloaded a whole bunch of tribes they had conquered, many of them from the Iranian Plateau area. And so you got a further intensive dilution of Jewish DNA. And so the society was becoming increasingly cosmopolitan. And we use that expression, but that's how it developed right from the get-go. They were more cosmopolitan because they didn't get their feet on the ground, push the Canaanites back, and claim the territory. And therefore, they didn't have the same claim to God's promise because they had not fulfilled their contract. That was in the consciousness of the Jews at that time. Let's see, they were fewer in number, and in fact, they were almost extinct by the end of the Roman period. The Pharisees got their respect from the people. The Sadducees got their respect from their position and status in life. But these forces splintered Judaism, this focusing on determining proper action, behavior, and not doctrine. That's the matter that split Israel. It wasn't a matter of the heart. It really wasn't a matter of doctrinal differences. It was a matter of interpretation and the application of and the acting out of many of the oral Jewish laws. And that led to a lot of quibbling and bickering. Then a third group emerged in this time, and that was the Essenes. And I'll be fairly quick with this here, but there's only about 4,000 of them, but they occur in history, and particularly the literature of this time. But their history is unclear. We know they lived in the Dead Sea area. They were community dwellers, communal living, shared living, kind of kibbutz style, I guess would be a way to describe it. But they were esteemed by the Greeks and the Romans because of their virtue and their discipline. They were respected. But they're not mentioned at all in the New Testament. And they too were extinct before the rabbis dominated Judaism. Known to be hyper-Calvinists, fatalists, wouldn't go into the temple because the temple was being defiled and was continuing to be defiled. So they lived in the wilderness in the Judean hills, dressed in white. Many of them were celibate, and much of the literature demonstrates an interest in herbalism herbalists and the art of peace. So they remain pretty much a historical curiosity. Some theologians suggest that Jesus was one. Most say he was not. Jesus was schooled in a traditional sense by the Pharisees. He was a rabbi, and he was probably himself in his early years a Pharisee until he rebelled. Another group just to quickly mention, because they're a product of this time, is the Qumran community, people associated with the Dead Sea Scrolls. It was 1947 when they were found. And as I mentioned before, there was, I think, 820 articles that were found there. About a third of those were biblical. So Bible believers, God believers got a real boost at that time by that discovery. About a third of the documents were non-biblical, however known in the literature at that time, such as the Book of Enoch, Book of Jubilees, and other pseudepigraphical documents. And there was about a third of the documents that were discovered or revealed at the time that appear to be really sundry notes, extracts. Some appear to be redactions from larger pieces and larger writings that remain unknown and are actually still being researched and reviewed. They too were a community, this was a community library. They make no mention of the Essenes. Literature also suggests that they were probably predestinationalists. And there's some Zoroastrian thoughts there. Their writings indicate that God has always been distant, remains distant, but there are intermediaries that govern what happens on earth. Much like the early Sumer in the Garden of Eden have the same concepts. I found my first mention, I've been looking for a couple of years of searching originalists, of the mention of a devil. And his name here is Belial, and the literature introduces forces of darkness, forces of light, and underworld, and this trend, this satanic, this devil theology is clearly adopted into the New Testament. Another group that survived this period was the alt-right group called the Hasidics or the Hasidim. However, they joined the initial rebellion against the Syrians, but once the Syrians had restored their rights, their worshipping rights, they broke from the revolt from the Maccabees and cut their own deal with the Syrians. Another significant name in this area was that of Antipater. I hope I'm pronouncing that right, but that's phonetically how I read it. Very important because he was the father of Herod the Great, okay? And he was approved by Rome, and what's important here, he was the first non-Jewish leader of Palestine. So he was the early cause of the split between Judaism and Herod and his followers, which are called Herodians, and I'll pick up more on them actually next week. So if you want to see who caused that split between Herod and the Judaism, look no further than Antipater. He was an Edomite and a descendant, therefore, of Esau. Some of the Edomites, they were seen as kin to the Jews, and it's not improbable that some of the Edomites were believers in Yahweh. Could be because of the allies the alliances that existed there back historically. So overall, though, this was an unsettled time for both Jews and pagans. They were questioning their gods, somewhat despondent. The Jews was hardly unified at this time, and they quibbled over matters of law, and they still do. But the other significant thing was that the Hasmonean leadership was deteriorating. Finally, two sons squabbled over who should be the leader and who should be the high priest, and they invited powerful Rome to come down and settle this conflict. And Pompey from Rome goes, I see opportunity here. And he invaded. But the invitation initially came from the Hasmonean family. So in 63 BC, Rome came on, of all things, the Day of Atonement, while the priests were in the temple in the middle of their prayers. And he ended Jewish independence right there. And so, yet again, the Jews found themselves under the yoke of the Gentiles, and the Romans would stay for 200 years. And many Jews were enslaved, and many of them were deported back into Rome, enslaved. So now Judea, after having 100 years of the chances that go with being under somewhat self-rule, are now paying tribute to Rome. So in conclusion here, I got just 9 or 10 points here. The positives that come out of this area and the impact on Judaism. Firstly is the commitment to one God, Yahweh. That was clarified in this time, and that commitment is clear. This family saved monotheism. Greek culture had introduced, as you know, a pantheon of gods and different alternatives, and some Jews had drifted away into various kinds of worship, but they were very much on a monotheistic track at this time. The diaspora that had gone on for centuries actually helped save that monotheism because there's safety in diversity. And so Judaism itself was really never at risk because there were many vibrant Judaic and conservative Judaic colonies around Europe at this time. Also, there's a birth of Jewish nationalism. They had a new sense of identity, a new distinctive faith was beginning to form. So it was a period of growth, emerging growth. They realized their strengths through their victories, their military victories. And many of them still hoped that a Messiah would be coming, even though many of the leaders did not believe in the Messiah. Importantly, they rejected the Greek philosophy of fatalism and predeterminism. And that was a big move. They clarified that. So earthly outcomes and human outcomes were according to God's will, the providence of God. It was a form of open theism. God was practicing his will. Predeterminism, I don't think predeterminism ever got back or made grounds in Judaism. I could be wrong on that. Josephus, the writer here, he clearly believed in an afterlife, that the soul was immortal, and the soul went to the underworld. There were forces of good and evil. But as some Hebrew writers of this period point out, is that this is Platoistic. This is not Judaistic. And people should not be confused that this was ever a part of Judaism. Jews rejected the proposition that the soul separates from the body and goes to the underworld. Pharisees believed in angels and spirits and that they were communicators from God, but the Sadducees never did. Endogamy, I think that was a new word for me. I believe that's practicing marrying within your kind. And that was explained to me as a young boy that I should find a good Seventh-day Adventist girl. But underneath this, certainly the Sadducees didn't, because they were already multi-ethnic. But there was a sense that it is better the Jewish marry within their kind because they were building a Jewish national empire. They were restoring pride and prestige amongst the people who had been decimated and attacked for centuries, oppressed and suppressed for centuries. And overall, we should remember that it was the urban Jews that were Hellenized the most. There were Jewish rural centers that really did not feel the sting or the pressure of Hellenization. And just to finish up with, is to remind us that this thing that we call the Hellenization of Palestine, or in fact the Near East, is really three-dimensional, multi-dimensional. It's spiritual, social, and psychological. And as Richard Rice mentioned last week, is Jews were confronted on a personal identity basis, not just a national identity. A personal identity, personal thought was promoted. And that's not a bad thing. Many Jews had felt that Hellenization would further their better interests, their personal interests, more so than Judaism. And so that caused them to look towards Hellenization because wealth, prosperity, jobs, the future, the Europeanization, as it were, of the region was a better way for many of them to go. And that explains some of their compliance. Now, the New Testament passes over this period without comment. But as we'll see in the next couple of weeks, there are strong themes that are clearly evident in the New Testament, and Forrest in particular, and I will work on those apocryphal themes that flow into the New Testament. So next week, I will address the Roman era and then begin to summarize what you can pull out of the 500 years of the Second Temple period, and we'll take a clear look at Judaism in the world of Jesus. But that's it for me, David. So back with Forrest and you.
Thank you, Rodney. That's a lot of material, lots and lots of material. You did a lot of work and we are benefiting from it. I'd like to proceed this way. I'd like to first say just a word about Cyrus. I don't want to get sidetracked into that, but I would like to say a word about Cyrus just in passing. Then I think the second step would be for us to ask Forrest, ask Rodney whatever questions we would like to ask him for further information or clarification or elaboration. Let's get whatever more we can from Rodney. And then thirdly, I think it would be helpful for us to turn to other members of the group who have things to suggest about this era, who have been there, who have studied this. And then let's get to the so what question. What does all of this mean for us today, if anything? It's, even if it doesn't mean too much to us, it is worthwhile to study this period of time. But I think there probably are insights and forms of wisdom that we might take with us. So just a word about Cyrus quickly. I want LaDon to know that I myself was not equating Cyrus and Rush. What's his name? Trump. I was reporting that many evangelicals do that. Many evangelicals say that Donald Trump is like Cyrus in the sense that He may not be a noble person, but he's doing a lot of good for the evangelicals. That's the point. Now, I'm not agreeing with them. I'm just saying that's what they believe. Now, since then, I've looked more into Cyrus's life, and he is on the merits, right? On the merits, a very different kind of person. And so,
absolutely.
You want to comment on that, Lodan?
Well, I think as a Persian, you study about how good Cyrus was. I'm sure he had faults, but his behavior, his love of freedom, and against all the culture of that day, his treatment of the conquered people was exemplary and unusual.
Correct.
And he is celebrated because of that. We don't know exactly what kind of an individual he was, but he was an honorable king because he did not continue enslavement, and he granted freedom for conquered people to go back. That is documented in history. So I don't know.
Israelites, right? Not only the Jews, but other peoples went back to their homelands.
Nehemiah, one of them. Nehemiah, remember, he went back to rebuild because of Cyrus's legacy.
Yeah, I did not know that Cyrus was so highly regarded. Is Cyrus a figure of note in contemporary Persian culture?
Absolutely. Very, very highly regarded. Absolutely.
So would most Persian youngsters know about Cyrus?
Yes. 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 We have a Persepolis in the southern part, the Parthian part of Iran, the Pars part. That's where the word Persia comes from, the Persepolis that is sort of like Acropolis. It was not built by Cyrus, but Cyrus's tomb rests in Shusha, near that area. And Cyrus is definitely he's like one of the, he's very well regarded. Very well. We are the land of Cyrus.
Do people visit his tomb?
Yes, in Shusha.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Okay, thank you so much.
And on Westwood Boulevard, is it on Westwood Century Boulevard? There's the scroll of Cyrus, representative freedom, because it is representative of a king who could keep people enslaved and did not. It was to his economic advantage to keep slaves, but he did not.
Lodan, we never mentioned how Cyrus was killed. Do you want to just share that story?
No.
Okay.
That's the sad part.
It is a sad part.
Let's just.
Well, what happened?
Oh, see, now we tweak their interest.
Lodan doesn't want us to go there, so let's keep moving. Let's move on to the question that we might have for Rodney. Are there any things that Rodney said that you would like further clarification on? Or are there things he didn't say that you wondered why he didn't? Let's see if there's anything more we should get from Rodney.
David, if people would raise their hand, that would be helpful to me. Or if you just wave your hand, sometimes I can see you, sometimes I can't. So if you have a question, raise your hand or wave it. So.
Okay, anybody want to jump in here? I have a question, Rodney. I think I need some help because I think at one point I took down notes saying that this was not a bad time for many people. And then I think toward the end, you described it as a quite unsettling time. And I wondered what life was like for the ordinary Jewish person, we'll call them, through this period. Were they affected dramatically by the comings and goings of all these happenings, or did their lives sort of go on quite apart from that?
It's a really good point, because I had to mull over that myself, because there was a difference between the authors who was writing and that I was reading. And it seemed to be that if you're reading, and Josephus wrote really for the Greek audience, and possibly a Roman audience, but a Greek audience. And so you've got to look at it from the conquered and the conqueror point of view. But many of a couple of the Hebrew writers that I was reading, they felt that it was a good time. But there were a couple of Protestant reviewers that felt that it was a time of lost opportunity and very little went on, and they tend to be more critical of the time. But actually how the people on the street, the people in the communities responded, I don't know, because they don't get a voice, A. But B would be that I think they started with a great deal of hope and enthusiasm. They got behind this family. They had the kingdom back, the temple restored, but they were now being self-managed. But as the Maccabees moved from freedom and reestablishing worship in the temple, and slid into family disputes as time went on, and self-interest, I would think that the people would have got pretty despondent. And that's why I selected to use those words, discouraged and despondent. But the other part of it was, so were the Hellenizers, because the Romans had them surrounded, and they had this sense of foreboding that they were going to be conquered, and it wasn't long after that they were, and Syria fell. And so it's kind of a rolling picture, because they weren't unified, I think I would use the word, there's a lot of confusion. But what emerged out of it were clarity around 3 or 4 Judaic principles that they refreshed and restored. And that's why I made those points at the end. They are the centerpieces of Judaistic beliefs, and I think they were reaffirmed in that time.
Okay, I have another question. We have Daniel 2, right? Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome. So I learned those as a youngster. I never heard about that 500-year period between Greece and Rome, and I wonder if there should have been maybe we should have divided the legs of the image, so that we have one part for the intertestamental period, and then go down, because there's a big 500-year gap in our account of the way we read Daniel 2 in interpretation for the whole of human history. Okay, anything else from Rodney?
Yeah. Hey, Rodney, can I ask you a couple questions just for clarification?
Sure, go for it.
Yeah, you mentioned that the only commandment mentioned 2 times was the Sabbath commandment. Was that what you said?
Yes, that's according to Biglino, the Vatican's transcriber.
On what 2 occasions are they mentioned twice?
Well, it's mentioned. I'm not sure if it's in order, but along with the other 10 words, because Christians that use the words decalogue and commandments, there were not penalties to most of the what the Hebrews heard. But from his writing, that the last thing that he said to Moses, as recorded by Moses, was a return to remember the Sabbath day, and that was coupled with penalty of death. Now, that is one Masoretic expert's translation of it, but no other commandment was mentioned twice, and no other commandment had the penalty of death associated with it. And that's his take on it.
And the other part was, you mentioned that you thought Jesus might have been a Pharisee. I'm just curious about that.
I'm kind of wondering already how. Sorry, Forrest, you want to finish your question?
No, that was it. I just hadn't heard that before.
In those general groupings that went forward, and by the time next week we get to the Roman Empire, there are several other groupings. There's actually 8 groupings that you can identify that were operating in the time of Jesus. But in that, Jesus was born to a descendant of David, and in that sense, a Davidian. His mother is from what I understand, and I have not gone deep into this at all, but from what I understand was he would have gone to a Hebrew school, a Jewish school, what we would today they call a yeshiva, a school, and which would be a conservative school. He was a carpenter. The carpenters were not Sadducees. Sadducees were the rich and the wealthy and the arrogant and the aristocrats. And so he would have been schooled by rabbis. And at least some of my readings they suggest, the Judaic readings say that he was a rabbi, trained as a rabbi. And Bernard and others might mention more than this, but I'm just sharing my understanding was. And so if he was a rabbi and belonged to any group, in a group of the masses, the people, he would have been a Pharisee, I think, in a grouping.
Interesting. You know, John Howard Yoder has a book out in which he argues that Jesus was actually a zealot, one of the revolutionaries of his time, but he differed in the zealot people, not in their opposition to Rome, but he thought that there should be non-violent opposition to Rome. And of course, Yoder's making that point today. We ought not to passively regard evil, but we should actively confront it, albeit in a non-violent way. So people identify Jesus with different cults, different of these groups. I suppose some see Jesus as a Sadducee, as a rather rational person. That's more of a stretch. So in any case, that's an interesting question. I think Bernard's on the queue somewhere for us.
Did you want to say something, Dr. Taylor?
He's working it out then.
Sorry, I don't know, the space bar isn't, isn't doing it. I will pass on what I was going to say, but let me just mention one thing here. I don't have my copy with me, but there is a novel written about the Maccabean period by an outstanding scholar of the intertestamental period, David de Silva, D-E-S-I-L-V-A. It's all one word. And David is a very well recognized and authoritative speaker who has written a fascinating novel of this period. If you took the opportunity, as Dave suggested, of reading First Maccabees, it's not easy going, but David has covered the period with all of the aspects drawn together in a novel that draws you in. And I found it invaluable in bringing life to this period and what it was like and who were involved where and the priests and all the rest of it. Again, the name is David de Silva, and the book is called The Day of Atonement, though the book never actually gets to the Day of Atonement, and some of us have been hoping there would be a sequel. Thanks for the opportunity to comment.
Bernard, what's his background? What's his credentials or background? Can you tell us a bit about that?
He's, since a boy, he's had a fascination with the intertestamental period. He and I and another were the translators, as I mentioned, of the Apocrypha for the English Standard Version. And he is very highly regarded and highly regarded in more conservative circles. And the book is remarkably true to the period, not just in detail, but in sentiment, the conflict of issues between the Greeks those are the followers of the Greeks in Judea, and the old traditional parties. And I have never found anything like it in bringing the period to life.
I appreciate you sharing that with us, Bernard. I certainly don't want to put Jesus in a box. You can't put him in a category because he was a tweener, he in the sense that he transcended through his journey a lot of categories that you might want to put him in. But one of the trick questions in here that theologians often like to throw, Protestant theologians like to throw out is, how old was Jesus when he realized he was a Christian?
That's a, yeah, well, okay.
I thought you would
put
like
that
it,
on the
David.
agenda to be discussed sometime in the future, right? In the future. Back to Bernard, did you want to say anything about what you were going to say but decided not to?
Well, I think I appreciate your dividing up the time left, and I think I naturally slot into the second period. And so let me wait till then, and others will have an opportunity now to, if when we're moving to there, then put me on the list, and I'll wait for your direction. And Rodney, thank you very much for your presentation this morning, and for the arm span. Most of us grew up with Breasted's view of the Fertile Crescent, which is just from Palestine around to Mesopotamia, but to take it from Jerusalem, from east to west, I found that a very effective illustration of the progression of it.
Thank you.
I did too, so I'll remember this from here on out.
My right arm won't get down to Euphrates, so I have to use my left arm.
Okay. Bernard, why don't you be the first person to speak in phase 2?
Oh, all right. Thank you. Well, and that was the first item on my list. You mentioned just briefly about the spread of the Hebrew alphabet and its interface with
Yes.
the Greeks. I, like many, misunderstood until I studied Hebrew. I thought it was a language of all consonants.
Mm-hmm.
But it turns out it's only the consonants, the 22 consonants that were written, but each word was to be pronounced. And to pronounce consonants, you need vowels to go in between. And so in the Semitic languages, the vowels have always been there. However, the Phoenicians, whether or not they were the inventors of the alphabet, as we call it, because alphabet is the first 2 letters of Greek and alphabet are the first 2 letters of Hebrew. So the alphabet was transmitted by the Phoenicians, who were the sailors of the day, Syra and Tidon, of course, on the eastern shores of the Mediterranean. And they took their alphabet, and the Greeks adopted it and adapted it, and they added written vowels into their alphabet. There are more pronunciations than there are vowels. And a piece of information that, I don't know whether you've ever thought about it, but it was 1963 when I first studied Greek. Why is our Z the 6th letter of the Greek alphabet and the 26th letter of the Latin alphabet? The reason is that when Rome came into contact with Greek, it found letters there that were not in the Roman alphabet, and they're the last 2, Y and Z. Most words like Egypt and mystery and no, not that one, but that have a Y in them are of Greek origin. Not exclusively, but when the Latins heard Greek, they heard a different sound than what they had. And this is why Greek words are transliterated with a Y, and they added it at the end. And in Latin, all words with Y are of Greek origin. And then you have the Z, which was added to accommodate Greek. The book of First Maccabees, and I just want to make a 2 or 3 points here. First off, the issue for the Maccabees was the wearing of purple. For them, that represented all that was evil. if you follow all the way through the book, the last of the Maccabees wore purple. So in essence, it was all a waste of time in terms of where it began and where it ended. It went full circle. And it was this close for the last of them. He almost became the high priest, though he had no qualifications. And around this time, the high priesthood was essentially up for sale, and the descendants of Aaron, well, that was replaced later by the Zadok priest in Old Testament times, but it was completely changed. And you mentioned the terms like Pharisees, and just to update it, modern Judaism is the direct descendant of the Pharisees. The Pharisees won out over the Sadducees. And so that's modern Judaism. However, in my tradition of training at Hebrew Union College, the home of Reformed Judaism, one of the professors there wrote a book called The Heir of the Pharisees, arguing that while the Orthodox Judaism may be the lineal descent physically, it was the Reformed Judaism, which was established in 1875, that in modern times was operating under the principle of the Pharisees. And you mentioned as in First Maccabees 1, the Maccabees were the pious ones, and the Hebrew word for that, of course, is Hasid, and the Hasidic Jews are the direct descendants of the Maccabees. So that brings it into perspective. In terms of what was involved here, and I think we've been pretty close to this, as far as the Maccabees were concerned, they were fighting a religious war. In reality, they were fighting modernity. Mm-hmm. And these are often difficult to distinguish. Mm-hmm. And what actually saved Judaism was the diaspora and those who moved out. We know, for instance, when they moved to Alexandria, they built a synagogue. Yep. And in the New Testament, and when Paul went out as apostle to the Gentiles, he went to synagogue, he went first to the synagogue, and he had a natural access to it because of his background under Gamaliel I. By the time he was thrown out on his ear, he already had an audience, and in Corinth, he set up next door in the home of the president of the synagogue. And so he was very successful there. And what enabled Judaism to survive was that there were the 3 compulsory holy days to be celebrated in Jerusalem, like Passover, and the diaspora would come into that. These were people of wealth. The price in Jerusalem shot up. That's why Jesus was camped on the hill across from the temple. He and his disciples, they couldn't afford accommodation. And when the price of a donkey tail became so high, this was taken by these people from overseas who had money, spent it freely, and this enabled Jerusalem and the economy to sustain. It's fascinating how it all works out. Mm-hmm. And finally, just 2 comments on First Maccabees 2, which I think will help us in the general discussion of Judaism and the canon and how they relate to it. We know the Apocrypha is not part of the Jewish canon, but it doesn't mean that it is not highly regarded. And you remember in 1967, there was the 6-Day War, which began on the Day of Atonement. the enemies roundabout chose a high holy day because they knew there would be no preparedness, and they took them by surprise. The Knesset, on the basis of 1 Maccabees 2, where it was decided that they would not instigate war on holy days, but they would defend themselves so they would not be wiped out in the process. And so the authorization for that, the basis for that is that that's what the decision was in those days. God never objected. And so there was a basis upon which to establish that without any fear of violating the spirit and element of the Sabbath.
Mm-hmm.
And in the same passage, finally, there's mention of Abraham. And it is said of Abraham that he trusted God, Genesis 22, and God accounted him as righteous, Genesis 15. And here is a development of a key theological idea that happens to come up just in passing. This is a wealth of information. Again, thank you for leading us through it.
Hey, thank you, Bernard. That was excellent. Mm-hmm. Appreciate those insights and look forward to more time with you talking on some of these things, because we can't just move away from 500 years of literature and history, and move into some other topic. This has to be rounded out in some way, and you're the man that we want to do that.
I still haven't contacted Bernard about when we can schedule him, because I don't know how long this is going to last. Is it going to go 1 week more? But whether we'll figure that out, and then we'll see when in his schedule he might be able to join us, if at all. So we're asking a lot of him. But I do want to ask how a good Adventist lad landed up in a Hebrew Union University. That's got to be a fascinating question we can ask at the time. Okay. Any other?
Got LaDon. LaDon's got her hand up again.
Thank you. I have a couple of things. First of all,
You've been muted, LaDan.
unmute. Okay, good. First of all, Jesus was a Jew, and here we are Christians. And when you talk about Judaizers, Hellenizers, as if they are people different from us. Americans look at the English history as a pre-American history. It is connected to our civil law. It is connected to our form of government. It is connected to our fights. I think that it's very easy to forget that Christians are descendants of Jews. Their struggles, their humanity is very much connected to what we struggle about. They were people with ambitions. They wanted to survive under Hellenistic rule. We want to survive under gospel of prosperity. How is that different from us who want to adapt? They wanted to be originalists, and yet they wanted to be progressive. I hear people talk about them, the Palestinians and Jews, as if they were very different from us. But their history is very much intertwined. Even Zoroastrians, the Mitras, the Zoroastrian, the Ahura Mazda, they are connected to what we regard as our faith and angels. And yet we talk about them as if they were those weird people and they were had nothing. They had people, they were people with similar affections and struggles. They didn't want to be poor. They didn't want to be enslaved. We don't either. please don't talk about them as if they were very different from us. They struggled. They wanted to learn. Jews wanted to learn and be up in everything. And yet we dismiss them as those Jews. They became Judaizers. Please don't. I will say something.
That's very helpful. In general, you know, Paul said that we Christians are the branch grafted into the tree, and we would not live were the tree not there. So,
can I just add in something in there, David, just quickly?
sure.
I appreciate you what you shared there, Ladane, and I've gotten so much more enjoyment out of reading, I'll use the word Judaistic history, than I anticipated. I'm enthralled by it. There are days that I feel I have the soul of a Hebrew. And as part of the reason I made comments at the beginning here is that we, as in the collective we, the broad collective we, owe Mesopotamia and the Hebrew people so much. I hear Adventists wanting to disconnect from Judaism. I know some of my Roman Catholic friends are not interested in the Old Testament or the Jews at all. And yet I don't see how we can ever uncouple ourselves from all those forces and those currents that are really part of us. You know, these are our inheritance. They can't be separated from us. And nor can the Hebrew people and the surrounds, their circumstances, be ever extracted from Seventh-day Adventist or Protestant or Seventh-day Adventist message. There is no such thing. We owe them so much, especially Seventh-day Adventists. So the notion that we can have Jesus only, Jesus first, whatever, is you don't have a sustainable religion that I see it. But there's a little book called The Gifts of the Jews. It's a fascinating book. You can read it in one sitting. I would highly recommend you reading it. In fact, I suggested Daniel in our class to read it, and he tapped me on the shoulder a couple of weeks later and said, probably one of the best books I've ever read, Rodney, thank you, called The Gifts of the Jews.
You know, this gets us into the big topic of supersessionism, which is a way of saying that a lot of Christians believe that once Christianity came on the scene, Judaism had no further reason to survive. And its continuation is sort of a blasphemy in the history of things. And it's a dreadful doctrine because it's led to all kinds of horrible, horrible things. But theologically, what do we say about the people of Israel? And I think lots of us have to consider the possibility that our views on this have been wrong. Second point, the Jews are being rehabilitated in current New Testament scholarship, and much is being done to show that our view of them is often stereotypically and negatively so. So there's a lot of new interesting literature on this matter of the Jewish identity of us. And I think the Sabbath is it's a link between Judaism and Christianity that others don't have the benefit of. Okay, who's next?
I don't see anybody yet.
Okay, I have a question. Let's go back to what Rodney said about the Sadducees and their conviction that they should believe nothing unless it were demonstrable. That wasn't the language. I need to figure out.
I think that's pretty much what I understood and what I said. Mm-hmm.
So my question is, what's wrong with that? What's wrong with saying I won't believe anything that's not demonstrable?
I wasn't saying it's right or wrong. I was just talking about a characteristic. But you see, there are those people, because it gets to the issue of faith. It gets to discussions of faith and rationality. The Sadducees, as I've understood them from the authors that I've read, we would call them, they want science-based, evidence-based information to work with. They were not people that engaged in gobs of blind faith. That's crudely using my own language on that.
The idea of evidence-based faith appeals to me.
And appeals to me too. That's my journey.
Yeah,
my journey.
What the evidence is and how
but I
we
don't want to
read
be
it.
A Sadducee.
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Sorry. I don't want to be called a Sadducee just on that alone. You know?
Yeah.
I'm not a rude aristocrat, I hope.
Yeah, I've got McKinley is speaking about science or demonstrable faith. Maybe McKinley wants to ask about that today.
Well, no, that's not what I wanted to ask about,
Okay.
but thank you. I might comment on that later on, but thank you very much for recognizing me. I was trying to get in there as David was talking. And thanks for the presentations. A question that keeps arising in my mind as I've listened to the presentations is, what is God's role in the events that your research have discovered and you've described? Is it possible to discern God's actions moving things along a path towards his desired outcomes? Are all of these random events? I ask the question because many times on my birthday, I take the time to reflect on the things that have happened to me over the year. And I'm sure many of you can identify with this sentiment. When I look back at seemingly random events in my life, I can see or discern God's leading in very specific ways. So I'd like to kind of throw this out there. What do Rodney and Forrest think, and perhaps others, as we've listened to these description of apparently random and disparate events?
That is an excellent question. I'll just go forward first and then pass this off quickly. But to me, that's one of the key questions, and it's part of my journey. And I have to go between my imagination and what I learn in terms of rational beliefs. But so what's my main point here is that you've got this 500-year period, and in that it was called a silent period, it indicates then in that messaging that God was silent. So what was God doing? And as David said last week, is God was never silent. We've learned now there's lots of useful literature out there. So I can go to my imagination as a God believer, someone who believes in a creator God, a God who has had to make a decision between whether he sends another prophet down to the Jews at that time, or what would his next move be in terms of working with the Hebrew people in a beta site situation. And that decision to move to the new covenant, the old covenant to the new covenant. There's a transition period in here. So if God, so then I go in my mind to a couple of very intellectual people sitting around at a table over a cup of coffee, trying to, talking about what are the pillars that have to be in place to launch the second covenant in a very successful way. So it would be successful. I believe, just in my own ruminations, it would have not been successful if Jesus had have come in 300 BC at that time, or 200 BC, or 100 BC. You can look at these movements and the development of civil development, theological development, and thought that has gone on in this period. And to me, and it's just personal, I can rationalize my way through this and say, yeah, you know, if I was a planner, a strategic planner, which I've spent quite a bit of my life doing this, I can see that Jesus coming at that time was a much better opportunity to launch Christianity, launch the new covenant, as it were, than any time previous to that. So I would challenge everybody. I know it's you have to do it in imagination, but you have good information here. Was it a good time for Jesus to come and the new covenant to be launched? And I'm going to suggest to you it was a pretty well judged time. But
Okay.
McKinley, I think in the end, it's a mixture of what information you've got, coupled with some imagination. but I see it as being very intelligent. I don't see it as being random. I see it as very intelligent. Anyway.
Okay, Yoli, I think
Providence.
Thank you. I find the notion of evidence-based faith interesting, but in some way I find it almost an oxymoron, evidence-based and faith, religious faith, because I don't see how the two, you could marry the two and make it really make sense. Because, for instance, I think groupthink and its corresponding, what would I say, demonstrative behaviors do not exactly present religious faith. You know, the two are different, and I don't see how you can make sense of the two together, because faith, my faith, I can experience God in a way that you can't. My faith is not transferable to you, but we can agree to certain behaviors. We go to church on Saturday, we believe this, we're different from that group. But I don't see how we can really make the two work well together. But I believe there's a place for each, and they're not as, they can all live civilly because they're both sides needed. That's
again, a very, if I may, just a very good question. Again, I'll be quick and let others at this, but I have to share with you my own personal, how I deal with these two pillars, faith and rational evidence-based belief. And I'm disposed to evidence-based belief. In fact, one of the things I like very much about Reindeer, when he did his series just recently, he said it's got to make sense. You know, the resurrection, the second coming, heaven, it should make sense. That's a reasonable disposition. So then it comes back to faith and my definition of faith, and Bernard and others might tell me that I'm dead wrong on this, but my definition as I understand faith is it comes from the same root as the word persuasion, you see? And when I was a young kid and asked at school, Rodney, what's your persuasion or your faith? What are you talking about? I don't know. Well, what's your religion? Oh, I know what my religion is. But even the forms that I had to fill out in Australia and in the English system was, they had the word, what's your persuasion down, that you wrote it down. Underneath persuasion means it's still evidence. So we don't have to, I don't believe in gobs of blind faith. I don't believe a rational God wants us to take a blind step into everything. And so when you understand that faith is extrapolated from the word persuasion, which is still information-based, be sensible, it has to make sense. That's the way that I deal with it.
Okay, as I listen to Yoli, I'm trying to make sure I understand. I think one point she was making is that each person's faith is quite unique to that person, and evidence is generalizable, and faith is particular, so you have a tension between the particular and the specific, and the general and the abstract. I think that was one of the things I picked up, and I think that's an important thing. The other was, I think, significantly different, and that is whether we're talking about one's own experience and groupthink.
Yeah.
Now, that's something worth probing, because we're all subject to the temptation of yielding to groupthink, and yet I just want to say that those are the two things that I picked up from what you said. Yoli, do you want to add anything to that?
Well, I would only add that the way God whispers to me might be different than the way someone else understands God. And so my understanding of God might be slightly different, but I can fit into because we all want to be part of a group, or, have fellowship. But I don't think we should expect everyone to understand God the same. And there's a big difference between private evidence and public evidence. Public evidence, you can count it, you could see it, you can repeat it. And I'm not necessarily talking about science per se. It can just be things that are just what they are. But you cannot understand and experience God the same way as someone else.
Okay, that's helpful.
We got
Now let's keep in mind we're working on McKinley's question about where in these events do we see the presence of God effective, and by extension, where do we see in our own lives the presence of God active? So that's the theological. We're talking about God's action in the world, in the past and in the present, and I'd like to suggest that when we ask that question, we often presume that there are events in which God is influential, and there are events in which God is not influential. So it's a clean-cut distinction between the two. And I wonder if we might want to reconsider that. Okay, who's up to bat?
Well, I've got Dr. Taylor again, and then I've got McKinley after that.
And then we need to hear from Danilo. Danilo, I've been really working on your comment last week that we are confident in truth and committed to discovering it. I just thank you so much for that. Okay, who's next?
Dr. Taylor.
Thank you. The part of the what's going on during this period of time, of course, it's an obvious statement at first, and that is that during this time, though we can't observe it closely, there is the growth from, or the change, I don't mean to imply anything, that I'm looking for something more neutral, how it developed, how Judaism developed. And there was a fundamental change with that. And I think it's in the context of the impact of the Greek culture, because at this time, Judaism was a relationship to a larger world. Alexander had opened up that world, and it touched all points with equal closeness, pretty much. And as Rabbinic Judaism, as we refer to it, began and developed, there was a conscious feeling of embarrassment about the placing of God in human terms. Anthropomorphism is the technical term, and the attributing to God of human emotions, anthropopathism. And so the rabbis moved very consciously, and they have recorded this. And in the Mishnah, in Pirkei Avot, about the fathers, there was the taking literally the commandment about not taking the name in vain and deciding that they would not pronounce it. And also that they would leave God in heaven. And so they developed a whole series of surrogate divine names. This is where they never tried to pronounce the tetragrammaton, the divine name, usually pronounced as Yahweh, though there are problems with that, but that's as close as we can get to it. And this is where the concept of the Shekinah comes from. The Shekinah, the word never occurs in the Old Testament, and I grew up with the idea that this was the name of the cloud over the tabernacle in the wilderness. But this was a word, it means dwelling, and the notion of it occurs in the prologue to John's Gospel. And he came, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was made flesh, and he tabernacled amongst us. That's the translation of Shekinah, the dwelling, the presence. And so in all sorts of ways, there was a clear separation between God and humanity. And so when the question is asked of this period, this was a time when they were not looking for miracles so much as establishing their identity under God, but no longer as a theocracy with God directly in control of it. And I think that should be kept in mind as we ask such questions. Not a reason not to ask the question, but what we may discover is different from the what we would, for instance, get out of the Old Testament.
Okay, so there's a huge transition here, and it's characterized by Jewish attempts to be credible to the Greek mind. Is that a way of putting it?
Yes.
And the question has come up over the years whether we gave too much to the Greeks in order to seem credible to them.
True.
Yeah. There are a couple other people whose hands I see.
Yeah, I see McKinley's next, and then either Jeff or Donna after that. So go, McKinley.
We need him unmute himself.
Yes. Thank you, Forrest. And Rodney, thank you for the answer to the question that I posed earlier. One of the things that I found fascinating in your description about the life of Alexander the Great was how he died. I found that very, very interesting. And the strategy he used, I think you said he sort of dressed himself in some lamb's or ram's horn. So when people saw him coming, they assumed he was some kind of a god, and that allowed him to achieve his conquest of the world then in a very short period of time. But as I listened to that, I related that to the text, I believe in Daniel 8. I haven't looked at my Bible to verify this, but where Greece is presented as the leopard with 4 wings, representing or symbolizing this rapidity of conquest. So as you describe those apparently disparate things, I can see those things being reflected in this vision of Daniel and that symbolism that it indicates. I do want to make one other comment with respect to the evidence-based faith. So this question comes up a lot when I'm having conversations with some of my other secular friends. And I like to often turn to what Jesus said, that faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the word. And in my understanding or rephrasing of that statement of Christ's, I like to use hearing as understanding and word as knowledge. So when you combine those two things, you have a stepped function where we initially come to our understanding and experience of Christ in faith. We don't understand a lot about how God works, so we accept and believe what we learn from Scripture. But then as we mature and we research, we interact with other people, we discover new knowledge concepts, our faith is sort of validated by those things that we learn along the way. And I think that constitutes the evidence that Rodney and Dave were referring to. And as I mentioned in the earlier conversations by Reinder, as new knowledge concepts develop by research, we're finding that many of the things that are contained in Scripture can be supported by, say, physics and engineering, and all of those alignments provide a solid basis for we as Christians to be able to talk confidently about the faith that we have in God, whether it be about the creation, whether it be about the resurrection, whether it be about the healings that the Scriptures talk about. So I think I agree with the idea of evidence-based faith, but then as Yuli mentioned, that evidence can be different and personal from person to person, experience to experience.
Good.
Thank you.
Okay, we have Jeff or Donna. I don't know who it is.
Can't you
Jeff
guess?
says Donna.
Well, I was going to pass, but now that McKinley's brought us back to the question, to Yoli's point, I wanted to say a couple of things. First of all, as information is accumulated, we get increasing levels of certainty about an idea or a concept that maybe before we had this much information was a theory, and then it becomes more than a theory, a hypothesis, and or the other way around. And finally, it's not a matter of faith anymore. It's a matter of knowledge. So there's a progression. There's a sort of a spectrum as something moves from a matter of, quote, faith or simply a somewhat disembodied idea or suggestion, and finally becomes a certainty. That, of course, is the nature of scientific research. I don't always willing, by the way, to be disproved, but nonetheless, always, I think, as a sort of an accretion of pieces of information that lead to what Reinder said, you get to a point where something is warranted. That is, it's no longer just a sort of a pie in the sky or disembodied and highly unlikely myth. That was one thing that was one thing. And then there are two books I wanted to recommend. One you've all heard me say before, because it's interesting. We think of history beginning with the Greeks. I would recommend The Silk Roads, which has been out for a few years. I think it is one of the best re-examination of ancient history and of the east to west pivot that Rodney was talking about. And the other is a book I just finished this week. It's a very easy to read, not written by a theologian, but it's called In God We Doubt. Some of you may have seen the book. It's written by an Englishman, John Humphreys, and of course, like all the English, he handles the language beautifully. It's a quick read, but I read it and thought, if I knew this person, I would think I would have written this book or could have written this book, because it so well reflects my own intellectual journey. So I recommend it. In God We Doubt.
Okay.
So one book was called In God We Doubt, which is a marvelous title. What was the other book?
Oh, The Silk Road. The Silk Roads has been out. And this book is about 10 years old or a little more. And if you buy this book, by the way, you will be supporting the kitchen table charities, which you may or may not have heard about, but he has dedicated the profits from the book to that group, and I think they're an excellent charity. Maybe because their mission is to the children of the world, the poor, the hungry, and he has a special burden for them. Anyway, that's it. So thank you.
Something.
Thank you.
May I say something?
Yeah, go ahead, Yoli.
Thank you. I agree with everything Donna just said. The only thing is we have my stated problem might be different. And if my stated problem is different and what I want to prove is different because of who I am, my lived experience, where I was born, and all those things, because we bring all those to everything, because I bring myself to everything. Then my research might bring something different. There might be nuances in what I get. That's just my point.
Good one.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay, Capinos, Elmer?
I want to be muted.
Let me go back on the blind faith issue here by Yoli. The origin, you have mental health professionals in the in the session here. I see Kim is one, and Dr. Tish is
I've
one.
lost my participants page.
But the origin of faith goes back to when the child is developing his mental life and is fully dependent on the mother. And the child is unconscious of what the mother is doing. So the child develops.
I can't get anything up there. No, no.
Can you folks hear me?
I'm sorry, I've been having a little trouble with mine and my wife's trying to help me, but go ahead, I'm sorry.
Okay, you want me to go back, or you want me to continue with where
I'm sorry, I did interrupt. I just didn't know what was going on. So why don't you start back just a little bit here?
Okay, the origins of faith goes back to when the child is unconsciously dependent on mother. And as a child develops his mental life, he feels that all his needs are supplied automatically, but that's not the case. The mother is always there. There's really a book, someone wrote a book about faith, and it's named Human Development and Faith by Felicity Kilcore. So those of you who are interested, you could buy the book. But basically, we know the origin goes back to this time. We know that because children who have been abused sexually and emotionally cannot develop the faith that you and I or the normal child develop. So when someone says you have to have evidence, the evidence is going back in time when the child relied on the mother unconsciously, that their needs were being met automatically, but it wasn't automatically. And that's where that evidence base, the evidence is the mother was there for the child, and the child developed a sense of God is there for me, and so it develops into a normal faith.
Thank you. Okay, I got Yoli again, and then I've got Danilo. So did you want to respond to that, Yoli? Okay, you're muted to me right.
Okay. You said the child developed a faith in God because his mother was providing for him. I don't see the connection. Those are two very different things, because children, their parents are their first everything. That's how they learn how to see the world, then school, and then so on and so forth. But you cannot equate that with how we feel about God, because some people, the people who are tortured the most, mistreated the most, a lot of time, those people are the ones who really gravitate to God because that's all they have. And plus that gives them such strength where they had none. So I don't see how we compare the two, because faith in human and faith in God is totally different. I can understand what a human being does for me, but I know God is always with me, no matter what's going on. Those are two very different things to me. I should agree more. I'm always disagreeable.
It's okay. That's all right. Stoning will start after the class today. So, but thank you very much, Yoli, and thank you, Elmer. Danilo, I think you're up. So go ahead.
I wonder if perhaps our how we view faith and really how we see trust is a little bit too narrow, and we're thinking of it too much in religious terms, perhaps too theological. At its foundation, all life is indissociable from the ability to learn and to respond in some manner. And this goes all the way down to the cellular level. It is not an issue just at the birth or even before birth. It goes down at the very core of being able to learn anything, To be able to learn means that implied in it must be present a trust of the very sensors that we possess. Even the cell has to trust its own receptors. Otherwise, you have no capability of learning. You have no capability of responding to anything. So we have essentially two forms of learning. We either learn directly from personal experience or we learn from another. The benefit of learning from personal experience is that, well, we're in this skin and each one of us is unique in a manner. And each one has a unique set of experiences. And we bring to the table the fruits of those experiences, what we have learned from being who we are. But the problem of that is that unless we're capable of learning from another, we're limited to only our personal experience. So the capability of learning from another expands our horizons tremendously. We don't have to reinvent the wheel anymore. We can tap into the experiences of others. This is the source, the delight, and the foundation of real humility. Real humility is the understanding that we're not sufficient to ourselves. It is not some posture that we adopt to another. If we limit it to a posture or an attitude, then we're missing the whole point. Pride is ignorance. Humility is understanding of what's really at the core of things, of learning itself. So, once we have these two basic components, the ability to learn from personal experiences and the ability to learn from another, both of these go all the way down to cellular level. Cells teach one another. They send care packages to one another with DNA, RNA, proteins, and all kinds of things. And cells learn from one another's experiences. This is how cells call other cells for help when they have a problem.
Yeah.
This is on a cellular level. This is stunning when we realize these things. So
what we have here is the scientists coming from their different specialists, highlighting different aspects of faith. The psychologist sees faith in psychodynamic terms. The biologist or microbiologist, I'm not sure, Danilo, will see faith in the cells. And I suppose a historian will see faith in great movements. The question would be, what's the common element in each of those that would make it justifiable for us to say, to use Donna's language, warranted?
May I add a little bit of cherry to this, if I may be allowed? The problem is that the implicit requirement for learning to be possible in these circumstances is trust. Trust that the messages we're receiving, trust that the messages we're acquiring are actually true. And that nobody's going to take the opportunity to feed us disinformation. But you and I know that we can get sick. How does that happen? A pathogen comes along. And the pathogen does not care about sharing information with other things. It only cares about taking advantage of other cells and whatever it creates as by way of havoc. So we have the same principles applying on the level of individuals. On
Good,
one hand,
thank you so much. I see McKinley's hand for us, but who's next? McKinley's had a chance or two to talk. Let's see who else we can get in.
Yeah, I've lost my participant screen. So is McKinley, are you still up?
I think we've got Gerald, a White House, and then we have Jeff Kao.
Right.
Let the people go first, and then I'll come in.
Okay,
Yeah.
Gerald.
Let's go for people who we haven't heard from yet, and we'll come back.
All right, Gerald, you go ahead.
Okay, I don't have anything to add on to the current discussion on faith. I'd like to go back to our discussion of this this period between the testaments, and I think one of the reasons we are looking at this that has been mentioned is to try and understand the environment in Jesus' time, the religious environment, the thinking of the people, Judaism at the time of Jesus. Try to understand that a little more clearly, and I'm still struggling with that. I'm trying to put that together, but from the presentations that have been given. But Ellen White describes the general attitude in summary at the time of Jesus as hopeless. I mean, there was a hopelessness among the people. They had lost any sense of hope or trust in God doing anything for them or whatever. And my mind goes back to kind of tracing the history. They had gone into exile. That was a big blow. They had come back determined to not fall into idolatry again. They were going to set up their faith system back in Jerusalem in the proper manner, and then that failed. And then you have the attempt of the Maccabees to free them from foreign domination, and that was their hope then, and that failed. And the Romans come in and they're under domination. I mean, all of that contributing to this hopelessness in the time of Jesus. I guess the thing I'm wondering, can we somehow trace the understanding of God, their faith understanding, and how that history fed into that hopelessness in terms of faith and in the time of Jesus. Anyway, trying to understand those dynamics is my question.
So maybe the best payoff is our understanding of Jesus. That's the best practical outcome we're going to have, is to have a clearer understanding of the times in which Jesus was active.
Can I just add one point to that? I appreciate what you said there, Gerald, and I don't think there's any absolute clarity on this. I think next week and maybe the final week, we'll get a much clearer understanding of Jesus in Jerusalem at that time. But one of the things that was beginning to ascend here out of that hopelessness was there were many people, not necessarily the leaders of the groups, but there were many people, it seems, that started to hope for a redeemer, a savior. And in that sense, the timing of Jesus coming and offering that, to me, I see that as somewhat continuous. But it definitely was, if we're looking for unification of belief and thought, it's not going to be there. This was a very, very divided population. But there in that division, you have to look for opportunities. And we can talk about some of those, but I'm still looking for the truths or the kernels that you're looking for. And maybe on the other hand, we could say the New Testament writers were really wise and informed by letting this period go to sleep. It's just, they didn't refer to it. Maybe they had a good reason not to deal with it. So my mind is still open and out there, but I do understand, you're trying to kind of pull out of this here, some kernels to go forward that you can hang out your thoughts on. It is a journey. It's a challenge.
Okay,
Well,
Jeff?
thank you. Thank you for your contribution, Rodney. I've appreciated the sessions.
Yeah, I would add to that. I agree, Rodney. It was very enlightening this morning, very interesting. And you may have said something about this and I missed it a little bit. You have the Sadducees, the Pharisees. I was always thinking that Jesus came out of the Essenes. Is that a separate group or related to these other two? That's one question. The other is, I'm not sure what the relationship between, there are different groups of Jews or Jewish believers now, and they divide themselves up. Are the Sadducees kind of the intellectual forebears of the scientists, scholarly, law professor Jews that we have in intellectual and university circles now? I mean, that if I was to make a relationship, I would think of them sort of as Sadduceal, and that is an adjective, if that's possible.
Firstly, groupings are always dangerous, but they are useful for discussion purposes, and that's why we tend to group things. But the answer to your latter question was yes. I mean, we could call them the elitists. They had the wealth, the money, the prestige, the power, and they controlled the temple organization and the temple behavior, as I understand it. So yes, I would see them, and they were about prestige, and that's where they got the respect of the people. They held a lot of power and authority. I think the first one is maybe argumentative. The way, again, I see these groups not being mutually exclusive. So Jesus certainly displayed some behavior, going to the wilderness, being a separatist from Jerusalem. There's some evidence there that some theologians, in what I've read, is that suggest that he was, in a sense. But on the other hand, most of them say no. But I know Forrester's got some thoughts on this. But Forrest, from your reading, what do you think? And I know it's pretty impossible to categorize Jesus in that he was transcending these groups. He was on his own mission.
Can I interrupt, Forrest? And here, let me just say the meeting is officially over. So if you're staying here, not to be disrespectful by leaving, you're welcome to leave. But no one is being encouraged to leave. We'll stay here as long as we find it useful. And so thank you. It's been a good time. Let's continue.
Well, we will take your name and write it. Anyway, I was going to say Jesus definitely was not an Essene. Mm-hmm. However, there was a very strong anti-temple, more than one group in the first century. And a lot of it has to go back to Herod, and also that the high priest, that position could be purchased at the highest bidder.
Right.
So I don't know. I couldn't say Jesus would be a Pharisee. I think, would you say Yoder, David, would say maybe a zealot? I'm not sure of that, but might come as close there. The other thing we need to recognize is the Pharisees were not very powerful in Jesus' day. They became powerful after the fall of the temple. And it's interesting that the writers of the Gospels comment extensively on the Pharisees and how bad they are. So it's probably because it was written later. Anyway, there's something else important I was going to say, but I can't remember what it was now. But so I guess I'll go to, I'm seeing Elmer, are you, your hand up now? And then I'm going to go to LaDon.
I was just going to follow up on Danilo's idea that some of these functions go as basic as a cellular. There are functions that we never teach. If you allow a child to develop, you will see that they will initiate social contact. No one teaches them these. Their eyes twinkle, they smile when they see the mother. No one teaches them how to do these things. I think the Lord included it in the blueprint. They are also inquisitive. No one teaches a child to be inquisitive, but they're always inquisitive. So, there's substance to what Danilo says, that some of these things probably the Lord just included in the DNA blueprint.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I think we're back to McKinley.
Oh, I didn't say anything.
I think
I
you said
want to say-
Ledan. Let
Oh, I'm
Ledan
sorry,
go first.
LaDon, I'm sorry. Thank
Okay,
you.
sorry. I want to say something in response to Jerry. I think we have models of groups. The Armenians in diaspora, they the faith, the Gregorian faith that they have was not as important as their individual recognition of they were Armenians in different countries. They survived being separate groups in different countries. The Kurdish people, their faith is not as important, but they survived because they coalesced as a people that were fighting for their own identity. And I think Jews in diaspora as well, it's very easy, I think, to say, okay, what was their faith, what was their belief or theology? But they were people who were conquered and who were dispersed, and they needed to stay Jews. How did they stay Jews? With circumcision, with Sabbath, with identifying with clean food. I mean, do you think that Nehemiah or Mordecai or Ezra's faith was the same? They weren't. They were Jews who were trying to survive and keep their Jewishness afloat. I think that's what this 500 years was. It was a people who were trying to survive. As people, they didn't want to be forgotten. Jews, we survived. We survived in Persia. How did we survive? We sometimes hid our religion, but we survived. I don't know about theology. Most of my Jewish relatives don't have much theology, but they know they are Jews.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
Just want to say that.
Thank you.
Thank you, LaDon. Now I think, is it McKinley? Are you at the bat now?
Yes, I think so. Thank you again. This has been a fascinating conversation. And I just want to try to tie a couple of things together in response to David's question when he asked the discussion about faith running through the historian perspective, I think the psychologists and the microbiologist, right? And Dr. Boskovic, I hope I say your name right, used the word a couple of times, learning, as important to the faith experience. And I like to tie that back to the text that I mentioned when I addressed this, which comes from Romans 10:17. Faith comes by hearing and hearing by the word. And so in that construct, we can substitute for faith, I think, confidence in God comes by learning, to draw on Dr. Boskovic's word. And then learning by knowledge and understanding. If I complete the text is by the word of God. So knowledge and understanding of the word of God. But that is also extended to other areas of knowledge and understanding that we can develop from other disciplines. And I think all of those things tie into what the presentations have been trying to help us get to, which is what was God doing during this intertestamental period? And I think we can be confident, Dave might have mentioned this, that God, working through all of these different circumstances and almost disparate events, was working out a purpose towards which Rodney said led to the Messiah coming, and then the transition from that Messiah period to our experience today, where we are learning about God, growing in relationship with Him, and looking forward to this future that Rainer also talked about.
Thank you. I see Judy Whitehouse.
Good morning. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. My mind is going to a couple directions. First of all, we're echoing each other.
Does your husband have a computer on too?
Maybe Gerald will have to mute his computer so we don't hear both of you echoing.
I'm muted, but it's echoing anyway. I don't know why.
So I shut one off.
1 second. Okay.
Jesus said that he came to reveal the Father.
It will still echo if you
And to glorify the Father.
1 second, Judy. We're not hearing you because of the echo. How can we stop the echo, everybody?
The problem is that Gerald's computer is playing her voice, and then her microphone is picking it up.
Right.
So if Gerald turns down his volume, then we'll be okay.
Okay, we need Gerald to turn down his volume. Maybe mute it.
I have been muted. But,
no, not muting your microphone. Your microphone is muted. It's your volume that needs to be muted because you need your speakers not to be playing the conversation.
Or Judy could just talk into Gerald's microphone.
Yeah, but she would then unless her volume is down, they'll have the same problem. If you have two computers in the same room, they'll feed back on each other.
No, I have turned my computer off.
All right, that should do it.
The whole lineage of the Jewish people and the Hebrew people, and indeed of all humanity, was God had given the sacrificial system as a symbol of the coming Redeemer, of the Messiah. So the sacrificial system, of course, was pivotal and basic to the Hebrew economy and the Hebrew mindset and even the Hebrew concept of God. Jesus came to reveal God, and he said to glorify his Father, which I always put in parentheses, to reveal his Father, to reveal the identity and the character of God. When the sacrificial system became polluted by considering it a way to appease an angry God, Mrs. White says that the devil had succeeded in making it of no effect. And so what was the Jewish mindset in the intertestamental times, as well as in the time of Jesus, of God himself? Was he a benevolent God, or was he a capricious dictator and everything that Satan had made him out to be to begin with? So in the environment of that mindset, then this was the environment of the origins of the apostolic church. So all of these things must coalesce to reveal God. And certainly, Ledan, the identity and the survival of the Jewish people has, to a great degree, depended on tradition more than theology, perhaps. And then in the apostolic and the missional church of the early Christian church, the very revealing of Jesus, actually God himself, who had come and allowed himself to be crucified, that became the impetus for the gospel to go to the world in the apostolic era, and likely our era as well. So I look forward to your developing these things more, Rodney, in the next week. Thank you so much.
I guess the question is, did something specifically distinctive emerge in our understanding of God in that period, that 500-year period? Did people understand God differently at the end of it than they did at the beginning of it? If so, in what way?
I would just share a thought on this, is that I put more attention in thinking to God as a civilizer. The amount of information that he gave to Moses was how to launch really a new civilization. And if you look back at that time in history, virtually every other nation surrounding Jerusalem had a God that was doing the same thing. And so part of my thinking is that God needed to advance a civilization, the Hebrew civilization, and maybe other civilizations too, given the conflicts that were going on, to a point that it was the right time for Jesus to come. And so what I see during this 500 years is a lot of advancement in just in civilization and civics. That's something I didn't know before. I mean, you can think of this and look at this through just a theology prism and go back and forward and round on this. But there was a greater movement that was going on. The world didn't stop for 500 years. Judaism didn't stop for 500 years. Writing didn't stop for 500 years. You know, the world was advancing. And so if you're a wise, intelligent God, there is that factor in my mind, you have to choose the right time. And part of that has to do with where was your civilization, and where was it stuck, and what was breaking down, and how do I try and move it to a better place and launch again, reset, you know, and go again. And you know, and so I do see within that framework in a way that I never saw it.
You know, I would jump on that a little bit in the sense that if one were to believe that a God was not active, then what about what happened after the first century? You know, for the last 1900 years, has God been active? I don't think people would say no. So just because of the absence of divine revelation doesn't mean God was not active.
I think from a point of view of a Jew, they had a temple and it was destroyed. They had Shekinah and it was gone. They had David and Solomon and they died. And then 500 years and nothing. And then Jesus comes and says, you have the laws and you can manage. And then they resisted because they wanted another theocracy and it didn't happen. Jesus says it's not going to be. And then how would you like to be a Jewish historian and look at these and look at World War II? Where is God? What has happened? Is he all that? I mean, there is support. There is for Christians who have been the conquerors and establishers of churches and rules and everything. Yeah, we have Christ and it's been wonderful. But if you're a Jew, what happened during World War II? Where was God? How do you relate to God's presence and you still have your faith in the laws that have to civilize people? And I think that's what Jesus said. The poor will have with you always. You ask the question, what is social justice? Jesus says you poor have with you always. What are we doing to make sure that the poor survive and they live well? Moses gave public health laws. Do we always have those? Do we protect people? I think we have the laws, and because Christianity has prospered, we think, to hell with the rest of them. But where is God here? Did God say to the Jews, I'm going to come back and have theocracy? Do we have theocracy for Christians? Do we have the gospel of prosperity for Christians and nobody else? I think I'm with Rodney. God came and gave us ways to be civilized, and Jews have kept it up. They have given us laws, constitutions, and I think we sometimes misunderstand because Christians have been conquerors. And I don't want to come back and Jesus say, I don't know you. You didn't, I don't think Jesus wanted to establish theocracy. Sorry.
Okay, thank you so much. Why those
I
are searching questions.
agree.
By the way, Yoli wants to talk, but I'm going to sign off, David. So if you'll
Okay.
monitor the screens.
Thank you
Nice
very
seeing
much.
everybody today.
I hope to see you next week.
I shall be here.
Thank you.
Dr. Basco, God, I want to say
Go
something.
ahead.
Dr. Basco, I want to thank you because I just had a aha moment because I do mistrust a lot. And I think sometimes that brings a sort of barrier. I'm like a back to the wall sometimes. And I think I need to kind of work on that because sometimes perhaps I don't hear everything I need to hear because I have that posture. That was a good point, and I thank you for that. Goodbye.
Now, what are you thanking him for?
I'm thanking him for mentioning, he mentioned something I agree. He made a point about trust. And it's true, when you don't trust, and I don't, and I'll be the first one to admit that. I don't trust because the way I see, I don't trust many people, you know, and because of that lack of trust, I see things, I'm always prepared to, you know, I don't trust, it's basic, I just don't. And I have good basis to put that on, but still, I have to remain a little bit more open to truly listen before I respond to certain things. But I still trust the way I feel in most cases. But I thank you for that. And one day, Dr. Larson said something, then I realized our differences is really immense. Because a conversation about eating meat, when Dr. Larson said, once you be something, a difference between why would you eat steak instead of talking about Play-Doh? And I went, oh my God, most of the world cannot even have beans, you know, from my view. Because Dr. Larson is a prominent person, he lives well, and he lives, because most Adventists lives in a bed of an Adventist cocoon. Not everyone, but most. But, and I'm thinking most people can eat, most people can have water, most people can now with the pandemic can wash their hands. They're dying just for basic things. And children, thousands die of malnutrition and not having food. And for someone to say, don't eat meat, read Play-Doh. And I thought, wow, that is so. And I realized, oh my God, this is so different. We can't hear each other.
Did I say that? Don't eat meat, read Play-Doh?
No, you say a lot of people, when they become Adventists, instead of going, they go and have a steak. Instead, they should read Play-Doh.
I see.
I'll never forget that.
Okay.
Thank you. Love you guys.
Something that Sister Ladan said that struck me, and that is that Jewish people had all these great, wonderful periods of greatness in their life. And they've been trying to somehow recapture some of that. And it struck me, is that not similar perhaps to our early experience with God? Perhaps to call it the early rain experience with God. And then we're mired in a prolonged period of having to wade through a swamp of dysfunction that the rest of the life living and working represents. We have to constantly contend with all manner of problems that we deal on a daily basis, and those wear us down. And we long to be back to the days of glory, the honeymoon with the Lord, as it were. But the Lord never promised us the early rain for the rest of our life. He promised us a latter rain towards at the right time. And then it struck me as I was thinking about that, well, the latter rain is going to be different from the early rain. And we're different at that point. And the purpose of the latter rain is to bring the fruit to its ripening. So then the question that struck me is, when the Lord comes to collect the fruit, what is he looking for?
Wow. Okay. That's a good question on which to conclude, I think. Thank you, everybody. Let's call it a Sabbath, and we will continue here next week.
Thank you.
Thank you, David. Good discussion.
Very good.
Happy Sabbath.
Thank you, McKinley. Thank you.